Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. And today we have a special guest, Cian Brittle, who is our motorsports writer. So we are going to get into things all motorsports today with start of new seasons going on and some already having success in their first races. But the one thing I do want to talk about before we get off to things, because we've got three different nationalities here, different perspectives. I'm attending a wedding this weekend. I'm very excited about it. The weather is supposed to be perfect here in the UK, which is a rarity. But this will be the first time I've ever been a day guest at a wedding. In America, you just get invited to the wedding. There's no such thing as a day guest or an evening guest. Every wedding I've attended in the UK so far, I've only been an evening guest. And I have to say I love it because I just show up, I eat, I drink, I dance, and that's it. So it's going to be a new experience for me. I've never been a day guest at an English wedding before. And I'm curious to know sort of what my expectations should be. Nick, I'm curious to know if that's the way they do it in Australia. Is it just a one-off invite? I have questions about the way weddings take place over here.
Well, so many questions. I'll give you my experience. My take is that I wasn't familiar with this whole two-tier style invitation process. And the first time it happened to me in the UK, I was like, what? I'm on the D list, and haven't been upgraded to the top one. But it is a very common thing, and I just think if you're invited to the second half, then obviously they know you're up for a good time and going to bring some life to the party if you get that invitation. But it's a bit of a curious mix. In Australia, I don't remember ever having that two tier or two level approach of invitations. Is pretty much stock standard. You get an invite, you're in for the long haul. So yeah, I think there's some pros and cons to both. I do think though it's a little bit backwards in the sense that if people are doing it from a cost saving perspective, the costs are going to come later in the event. So I'm not sure why you would not invite someone to the earlier bit unless just you have a venue that's got some limitations. Perhaps I'm not too sure.
All right, defend your country's honor, Cian. Tell us why we're wrong.
Well, I don't want to show my age too much here, but I'm still quite before my friends getting married yet. So I actually have only been to one wedding of my friends, but that was a full day affair. So I luckily made the cut for the proper day out.
Yeah, well, like I said, I don't mind just showing up to the party. Maybe I'm not as romantic as I should be, but it's like I've had my own wedding. I've gone and done that. I don't need to see the vows and all that. I trust if you're getting married, you're doing it for right reasons and you love each other. I'm just here, like you said, Nick. I'm just here for the good times.
I just wish that in more weddings that I've been to, they do the classic American thing that you see in all the movies of, speak up or forever hold your peace line. I've never actually heard that used in a wedding, and I would love to see that more in action, just to bring the heighten the chances of someone throwing a curveball in the mix. That little bit of angst or nervousness, right for a split second, everyone's like, no, we're good. Okay, let's keep going.
Well, not to get too far into weddings, but Cian, am I right? I think my wife told me about this. There's some old English law where you have to publicly post that you're getting married in a town square a month before the wedding, so that anyone can object. I'm pretty sure my wife has told me this is a thing that you have to publish it in a newspaper or something like that.
I feel like that rings a bell. There's definitely some element of, I think the line over here is if anyone knows any legal reason why these two people cannot be married. That's the line that's trotted out on the actual day. But I think that rings a bell, having to make people aware of the fact you're getting married a month before.
Yeah. So if you don't do it, does that mean you're married illegally in the country? What's the deal there?
I mean, I'm not really sure on the legal ramifications of it all, Nick, but I'm sure
you didn't expect to come into this conversation be talking about weddings and being our resident UK law expert on weddings. But apologies to throw you under the bus.
I didn't brush up on my wedding knowledge beforehand.
I'm not actually sure if we did that, but it does ring a tiny bell somehow.
Were you married in the UK, Nick?
Yeah, I was. I did a civil one and then one overseas. We did Croatia for ours, which was
I think I knew that. I think that was right when I joined the company, right, Nick?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it was, and it was. What the thing is, we did it in Dubrovnik, and I'd done it. Been to Dubrovnik before, but that was pre-Game of Thrones. And for those that aren't familiar, I watched Game of Thrones. Basically, a lot of the castle scenes and stuff. There's a lot of shots around the edges of the old town in Dubrovnik. So I was a bit overwhelmed with the sea of tourists flocking to the place, because it was almost like one of those uncovered or I guess tourist spots that wasn't too overwhelmed yet, but now it's clearly gone the other way. And it was an interesting proposition when I got married and walked out and there's these tourists taking photos of us at the venue. We're like, why are you taking, I don't know who you are, why are you taking photos of us? But just because there was a wedding going on, they decided to take half a dozen pictures of us from random tourists. So it was quite an experience, I have to say.
They knew it was the future co-host of StreamTime Sports.
Must have been writing on the wall somewhere.
So enough talk about weddings and to do what we came to talk about. And today is to focus on motorsports. Now, it's something, Nick, you and I, we will talk about Formula One, but Formula One is just one of many properties in the space. And Cian, you are our motorsports writer. You were part of our Black Book Motorsport group, Black Book Motorsport Forum. We should all give respect to Pete Jones, who's an incredible individual. Anyone that doesn't know Pete Jones and you're interested in motorsports, as much as people think Nick is well connected in sports, Pete Jones might be even more well connected within the motorsports. Like, he's genuinely that guy. So Cian, maybe perhaps it's just a little bit worth, before we dive into it, just like making people aware what we do in the motorsports side. Nick, maybe you can even give a bit of a SportsPro history, because my understanding is SportsPro started as a magazine on motorsports. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll kick things off there. I'd say actually our legacy of the SportsPro business is was from the F1 world. We actually had a magazine that was built on F1, and the Black Book was launched as an annual publication off the back of that, which was effectively a business resource and a directory around the motorsport industry, F1 in particular. Over the course of time, the opportunity was seen to diversify the type of content we were publishing to be much more broader than just F1 and expand into sports. And that was partially what we started to see at that time. This is going back a long time, before my time even, which was like 16, 17 years ago. That the data of subscribers at the time was right across the sports industry, not just in F1 itself. So that was when it effectively was converted into a SportsPro and a more wider sports proposition. But the Black Book continued on as it in its form, which was this annual publication, taking a much deeper dive into the business side, finances, the companies, the people, etc. And has existed technically way before SportsPro's brand was launched, and has evolved from being a publication and a guide to basically a membership community. Obviously, the content that we cover around the business side of the sport. So what you will find is a lot of the stuff that we cover and that Cian writes about is very much explicitly on the business side, whereas most other outlets that do cover, they lean more, they might cover some of the business related stuff, but it's typically through the lens of what consumers are interested in, but we're talking to the industry. And so we have the media channels, we have the podcast, we have the event that's happening in a few weeks' time, and we have a pretty impressive group of members as part of that group that you're referring to, that Pete has his connections with, that we've been serving for a number of years as part of this membership group. And it's been a really exciting sort of development and extension of the SportsPro business to be able to create a legitimate community that is really engaged, meet up several times a year at the different things we do, not only in the UK, but indeed globally. And Cian does a great work, which you can dig into now about the sort of stuff we cover on the content side, and making sure that we've always got insights and content being published that gives value to members and also just the general motorsport community.
Well, yeah, Nick, I think you've done quite a comprehensive job of summing up Black Book Motorsport there. But yeah, I mean, in essence, we are the business community in motorsport, and I guess a one-stop shop for all business-related news, covering any kind of motorsport series you can imagine, anything from Formula One to electric scooter racing. I mean, it's the breadth is pretty massive. I've written about some weird and wonderful motorsport series in the past, but yeah, I think having those touch points across the industry and having access to our members and so many senior executives across all series, that sort of business community and that community element of Black Book Motorsport is what really makes it stand out.
Before jumping back into the StreamTime content, I wanted to thank our partner for this podcast, Placer AI. Are you ready to take your venue to the next level? Placer AI's location intelligence can change the game for your sports business. Whether you're managing a stadium or looking to boost fan engagement, Placer AI's real-world insights help you to analyze performance and drive visit growth. With Placer AI, sports organizations can understand key fan profiles, benchmark against competitors, maximize sponsorship value, identify new revenue opportunities, and prove advertising value. Placer AI is the best-in-class accurate location analytics for professional sports venues and events. Learn more at placer.ai. Brilliant. So as we go into things, Cian, just to maybe set the scene a little bit, we'll go into some specific racing properties as we go along, but just, maybe are there any top line statistics, anything that sort of people should be aware of when you start thinking about motorsports in terms of kind of the scale, the size of the audience? We talk about, viewership numbers for the NFL or the Premier League, stuff like that. Generally speaking, how would you maybe perhaps describe the audience in the motorsports world?
So I think it's difficult to say on a wide scale for motorsport, but if you drill down into something specific like F1, a study came out last year that had the global fan base at about 750 million. If we consider Formula One as the premier form of motorsport around the world, then that probably gives an idea of the scale of other motorsport series that can add into that. I think if you're a motorsport fan, you are often a fan of multiple series. We can probably drill down into specifics later on, as I think NASCAR fans are quite, loyal and hardened to that series and reticent to expand into something like F1. But you've got that sort of massive global interest in the Premier Motorsport Series. I think the study said it's the fastest growing global sport in the world since 2021, which gives an idea of, I guess, motorsport's growth that it's had in recent years. And I'm sure you've spoken plenty about the Drive to Survive effect. I feel like I'm repeating myself over and over again in recent years talking about the Drive to Survive effect, but it's true, and the effect it had on the sport as a whole, not just F1, has been massive.
I remember that when we were running some of the Black Book events, gosh, I'm not exactly sure what time, but probably 5 years, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And there was a real concern in motorsport, the community as a whole, but also around F1, like where was it going to go from here? How was it going to possibly drive the growth that it needed, the audiences, the engagement, and then the commercial revenues to keep bankrolling it? Because in many instances, a lot of motorsport is funded by wealthy individuals who want something fun and exciting to get into, and then there is opportunities commercially, but there's a lot of loss leading teams and even competitions that exist in the world underneath some of the bigger names that we're going to talk about today. And then all of a sudden, in the last few years, whether it's, you can look at the documentary series like we've talked about, whether you can talk about other things like what F1's done through social media has been really impressive after they were obviously in hibernation for so many years, or other things that have really changed the shape of that. It seems that motorsport is in as healthier position from a fandom perspective as it's been in some time.
One of the things I took from your answer, Cian, I think it's really true, and something Nick and I have talked about, is people that are a fan of motorsports probably are a fan of multiple series. We've had the conversation. One of the differences between like the US and Europe is, you look at data in the UK, you're usually a fan of a Premier League team. You might watch rugby or cricket, but like there's not as much cross pollination the way like the US or Australia is, where they're really kind of sports mad about everything. So I would be interested, how much of that sort of a rising tide lifts all ships. Has the growth of Formula One really been beneficial to everybody else? I would imagine so, but like just be curious to hear from your perspective.
I think there is definitely an element of that in terms of Formula One's growth definitely benefiting the wider motorsport industry. Maybe not as much as some people would think. I think Formula One is definitely out on its own in a way in terms of the sheer level of growth that it's seeing. I think it's fairly unprecedented in sort of the sports industry as a whole. But I've definitely seen, I guess, maybe some more European interest in the American series like NASCAR and IndyCar. I think that there's definitely been a knock-on effect of Formula One becoming more popular as fans maybe looking elsewhere at other series that they perhaps didn't consider before. Because I think European fans obviously quite tied to F1, American fans quite tied to NASCAR and to a lesser extent IndyCar.
Well, that sort of leads me into kind of that next general question, where we've seen Formula One be very explicit about their desire to grow into the U.S., and we've seen that in other sports as well. The Premier League managed to get into the U.S. with NBC before all the other leagues, and you kind of see that trickle-down effect. But the one I hadn't been aware of or hadn't thought of was how American sports are now proliferating perhaps into Europe. So maybe just sort of what you've seen in terms of European racing competitions trying to spread into the U.S., but maybe even off the back of that, some of the effect of that going the other way as well, because that's probably one I've not thought as much about, because I know the joke is NASCAR, you just turn left.
That is the classic joke about NASCAR. I mean, NASCAR has tried to get more international. They're racing in Mexico for the first time this year. It's the first points race for the Cup Series that's been held outside of America. So you've got that sort of initial first step. I know NASCAR wants to expand into Europe. They have a European series, the Whelen series that races in Europe, but they want sort of their main Cup Series to have a race in Europe. I know that that's the eventual goal for them, but I think it's going to be quite slow progress. Whereas you compare it to F1, which has obviously expanded into America, exponentially. There's now 3 races there. You've got the original race in Austin, but that's been complemented by Miami and Las Vegas. The Vegas race, I think a lot has obviously been said about the investment that they've put into that, over $500 million of Formula One's own money to make that race happen in a fairly unprecedented location, having Formula One cars drive down the strip in Vegas. It's very overwhelming and doesn't really feel like an F1 race at all. But I think that, for me, shows the importance of the US market, that Formula One is willing to take these kinds of risks to expand over there. And I see it in other series as well. I've spoken to MotoGP off the record, and I know that that series has seen growth in the US already, even before this potential Liberty Media takeover comes in. I know it's their number one market for Video Pass, which is their over the top video offering. It's their number one market for merch sales as well. And this is MotoGP very early on in its journey in the US.
A couple of questions, Cian. Now, the Liberty Media own F1 and MotoGP, right? But Liberty Glow, technically, the dawn is not done yet, or it's still under contention.
So the MotoGP deal isn't finalised yet. It's currently in EU antitrust courts. The regulator is basically concerned around, I guess, they think that Liberty Media are going to get too much control over media rights by controlling F1 and MotoGP. If you go back in history, CVC Capital Partners bought F1 whilst they owned MotoGP in the early 2000s, and the EU
MotoGP as well. The
EU regulators told them that they couldn't own both, so they had to sell MotoGP.
Okay.
So we're kind of having a repeat of history here. But for me, I think the market has changed so much, and it's F1 and MotoGP, even just as motorsport series, are so wildly different and at such wildly different stages of their growth that I don't think you can compare them. And sport as a whole is now competing with entertainment. I mean, it's not Liberty Media controlling the market at all. So I'd be very, very surprised if this isn't approved. I'm expecting sort of middle of this year for Liberty Media to be officially the owner of F1 and MotoGP. But to preempt your next question about Liberty Global, they own Formula E, which is the all-electric version of Formula One.
So I tried to get my head around, are they connected? And I actually saw that they are sort of connected from what I saw online. And then I chat GPT'd it to confirm, and then he literally gave me 2 different answers depending on how I worded the question. So what is that? Are they a subsidiary? Are they connected in some way or not?
So they were the same company, and then Liberty Global was spun off from Liberty Media. I believe their only connection is that they have the same chairman, but they are separate companies.
So they're same chairman. No, it's coincidental. I think that's there's something there in that. It's just interesting that
there's definitely something there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just think Formula E, I'm not sure if we're going to dig into it, but we've obviously had Artie DeBas, who's the chief media officer for them, on as previously as well, talking about their approach, which obviously is having to be very different to the other properties, which they're going to be spending a bit more time today. The other question I had very quickly, maybe we'll dig into some of the numbers or what comes to mind here, Cian. But the thing I saw with the F1's revenues that you recently wrote about is obviously they continue to grow at quite some scale. The interesting part, I think, is when you look at other sports more generally, typically media rights makes the bulk of the revenue for the bigger properties, and then all the others are much smaller in comparison. The F1's revenue model is quite different to most of those because of the hosting fees and the events-related revenue that it generates. Could you just talk us through how that mix looks from a the macro revenue buckets, I guess, that they have in the business?
Yeah, so media rights is still the biggest revenue driver for F1, but you're right in bringing up the race promotion fees because it is very, very close in terms of how much they contribute to F1's overall revenue. In the most recent figures released, media rights made up 32.8% of overall F1 revenue. And then race promotion fees was 29.3. So you're talking two very, very similar contributors to F1 revenue. And you've got that model that Formula One has done so well, the traveling circus almost that goes around the world and, generates so much in terms of revenue from the races, especially, the newer tracks that they go to in the Middle East. They're amongst the highest paying circuits on the calendar. I think Abu Dhabi pays 50 million to host the race. We're talking, big fees. And I think it's a very separate point, but why F1 is moving away from its European heartland because the European tracks do not pay as much. And I'd be interested to see whether the Vegas model is rolled out a little bit more with how F1 has obviously promoted that themselves. So they've made the investment, which is unlike Formula One. They've never done that before. So I'm interested to see whether that model is replicated in other places.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of StreamTime Sports. This episode is brought to you by our partners at Kanto. Content is the MVP of the sports world. Whether it's engaging fans, building brands, or driving revenue, it's a game changer. But keeping up with the demands of instant platform-ready content, that's a tough play. Enter Kanto. Kanto's industry-leading digital asset management platform calms the chaos of managing sports content. From AI-powered searching of matchday photos and rapid creation of B-roll videos for social media, to giving sponsors, players, and agents quick, easy access to branded assets, Kanto keeps your team focused on the action. Just ask Maserati Racing, NASCAR, or British Fencing. They've streamlined workflows, boosted fan engagement, and strengthened sponsored relationships with Kanto in their corner. Ready to level up your content game? Visit Kanto.com today.
I mean, the follow-up to that, the question I've got, or I have a bit of understanding of this from my other conversations I've had, but I'd love you to articulate because you'll do a way better job than I would. Is just talk about what a hosting fee is and how what that does or doesn't include in terms of the delivery of those events, if you could.
So, I mean, basically it's the rights to hold a Formula One race in simple terms. Formula One has so many touch points around the world, and it's a marketing play for so many countries to bring Formula One to their country and to put on a show. And I think the hospitality side of Formula One is really where this all kind of comes through. You've got that chance to host, potential brands, potential sponsors, companies use Formula One races as such a home to sort of generate that revenue. And I think I went to the Las Vegas race last year, and seeing how much of like a commercial hotspot that became was really interesting. So many brands used that race to activate their partnerships, and there were so many things built around the event itself, and it really was so much more than a Formula One race. It didn't even really feel like a Formula One race. It felt like the Formula One race was tacked on to this much larger, wilder event.
Well, yeah, tacked on to Vegas. Everything's wild in Vegas, from what I've been told, anyway. But the interesting thing, I think, for people to understand, and I think we're going to bring it back to the media side, I think, in a second here, but that those hosting fees is literally the fee to have the rights to host, but it doesn't incorporate the delivery of the event, right? Like a lot of the costs still have to be also picked up on top of that by the person that's secured those hosting rights. So most of the people that host these events are running it at a loss with the concept that they're going to generate the economic returns by. It could be tourism. It could be all these other ways that they might be getting value out of the marketing return that they can justify the expense for. It isn't 50 million to run this event for us in our city, which I think is a big distinction for some people to understand.
Yeah, it's just the rights to host the race, and then as you mentioned, it's this all the delivery on top of that, which is so interesting, and you see circuits taking different approaches to rake that revenue back in. I think we're seeing quite a lot more races have their ticket prices increase quite exponentially. I know Silverstone, for example, here in the UK, the ticket prices are now fairly extortionate for a weekend. I'm now looking at 300, 400 quid to go and watch a weekend of racing, which is now getting beyond, I guess, what I would believe is the realms of actually affordability, which...
Well, Formula One, if you're listening, Silverstone, make sure you sort out Cian with some tickets for the weekend so he doesn't have to foot that bill out. That's for sure.
Come on, Pete Jones.
But I think just why I wanted to bring up the hosting bit, Chris, is that I think what's interesting off the back of that there's that model that exists, and I'm not sure how the other series like your Formula E's and like are able to tap into that sort of level of fee. I know WSE and others have that ability in some instances to pull some pretty significant fees when it's appropriate. But the important part is when we talk about media is how do you maximize the value out of your revenue portfolio and getting the balance right of what you're doing on the media front to ensure you're giving enough value to those hosting partners that are paying the fee for not only the hosting the event, but the exposure of Abu Dhabi or Riyadh or wherever they might be popping up, basically to say, look, here's our city, here's our country on display. They're paying that as a marketing fee for it, right? So when we talked about F1, I think last week, and I had a couple of people reach out to me even about the fact that we were talking about them and the ratings question that I'd raised, which I think was in one of your articles, Cian, which was about the fact that the ratings on an average perspective had kind of flatlined over the last few years. Is that, okay, they still have to get the balance right of making sure they have the visibility, even if someone's willing to pay them a premium slightly more than the other, because they need to be able to sell that on to the hosting potential cities and destinations to say, hey, we're going to give you X millions of eyeballs to your race, not be hidden behind a paywall, say on one of the requisite streaming platforms where no one's going to see the fact that you're hosting this. I think it's just an important mix here when we constantly are talking, Chris, about the fact that now every sports probably has to take a more diversified approach to commercializing their sports, and this is why. And you can't just play the media rights big cash check anymore because there is other ways to generating serious returns.
Well, I suppose that leads nicely into the question around what Formula One are going to do next with their media deal, particularly in the US. And, Cian, I'm not going to ask you a question directly about Drive to Survive, but Netflix might come up as a potential opportunity. But, the news Nick and I have been talking about is the current deal they have with ESPN is set to expire. It seems like Formula One wants a significant bump in their media rights fees. Now, previously, our understanding was they had turned down Amazon with the hope that ESPN would be able to provide more coverage, which I think feeds into a bit of what Nick was talking about in terms of how you just provide this overall media narrative. Well, it doesn't sound like ESPN wants to get into a bidding war. Netflix is now the name that everybody is throwing in there. But it does seem like an important deal. Nick mentioned that Liberty Media is doing well. It's not as if the business isn't making money, so it's not like they need to necessarily break the bank per se. But from a strategic perspective, in terms of continuing its growth, satisfying its other media partners, what do you think is perhaps the direction Formula One ends up going, needs to go, particularly just having talked about how important the US market is?
So I think there's a lot of important, I guess, history before we consider, I guess, the direction that Formula One is going in. Formula One obviously has not always been a big sport that's been watched in the US. I'd say even now it's probably not that big either. If we consider that NASCAR is getting 4 million viewers a race, IndyCar just got 1.4 million viewers for its opening race of the season. F1 averaged just over 1 million last year. So we're talking F1 being slightly below IndyCar, which is, the perspective that you probably need before you consider F1's direction. ESPN obviously been a really, really good partner for F1 since 2018. That initial deal they signed was worth $5 million a year. If we're talking about the growth of the media rights in the US, that is definitely important to consider, because the current deal, which, as you mentioned, expires at the end of this year, that is worth about $90 million per year. And if reports to be believed, F1 are now looking for anywhere up to $180 million. So doubling the price of the media rights for a property which, as you mentioned, Nick, depending on if you're glass half full, glass half empty, they have either stagnated or declined somewhat. If we're talking 1.19 million 2 years ago to 1.13 million last season. So I think ESPN would look at that and think, we've taken Formula One as far as it can go. We've been a very good partner for the series, but there isn't any more growth that we can get out of this, and it's definitely not worth doubling our media rights. And ESPN had a period of exclusivity to negotiate this deal. Letting that expire was a pretty clear indication that F1 wants a significant rights increase out of its next deal. I think Netflix, obviously being linked quite heavily, I'd be very, very interested to see what direction that goes in. But I know that ESPN have told me that they are in no way willing to pay over the odds to keep Formula One. So I think we will see a new direction.
I have to say the idea of this exclusive negotiations window that ESPN has now rejected, maximizing twice. Oh, actually, I think I'm getting confused with Warner Brothers Discovery had an exclusive negotiation window with the NBA rights, Chris, when before that all blew up. What sports property is going to want to agree a deal with someone before taking it to market and trying to drive up some competitive tension? I think it's such a redundant negotiation loophole that they've been running. No wonder that hasn't played out the way it is. I just wonder who's going to be the right partner for someone like F1 in the market, where it's going to put up enough of a check to generate some income there, but also give them that reach and exposure. We talked about there's some obvious potential partners in, the major players, your CBSs and Paramount, or your Peacock and NBC, or then you got Netflix. I think for me, the Netflix question comes down to, a couple of things. Just how additive is it? If you look at it as it's about audience acquisition, subscriber acquisition, by having F1 added to the mix alongside their Drive to Survive stuff, is that adding it more value so they're going to get a net increase of new subscribers as a result of having that on the platform? Or is Drive to Survive so valued by F1 and motorsport fans or F1 fans that they're already subscribed by and large, so that it's actually the net gain is going to be quite marginal? And will they have to drive return through perhaps advertising initiatives using some of the commercial breaks that maybe exist? Because if they're going to use the traditional approach which ESPN has used, which is I believe using the Sky Sports broadcast production feed, which I think has breaks built into it from memory, but I'm not sure if that's actually the case. Yeah, just some question marks as to whether they will be able to get that value, because they've also been talking in public about being very pragmatic about the investments they make into sports. But we talked a lot about why it would make a potential good fit a couple of pods ago, Chris, about why F1 would make a partner. So, Cian, does anyone jump out for you as to potentially someone that would be a logical partner in the US for someone, or it could be really anyone who's willing to make the commitment?
So I'm definitely leaning towards Netflix. I think it makes a lot of sense for them, especially with the Drive to Survive link. I think, honestly, the crossover between a Drive to Survive fan and an avid fan of Formula One, I think that's two completely different things. Bear in mind, Drive to Survive came out today, the most recent season. I don't know if I'm going to get around to watch it at any point. I'm not really that excited for it anymore. We're at the 7th season now. I think at first it was obviously this new interesting thing. Formula One historically was quite closed off to providing that behind the scenes access to fans. So I think initially it was very, very interesting to see how things worked. Whereas now, Drive to Survive is, in my opinion, so detached from what Formula One really is. So I think once you've watched enough Drive to Survive and you get the process, you are then converted into a Formula One fan, and Drive to Survive becomes, less needed in the process. So I think, that sort of crossover maybe isn't as much as some people might think. So Netflix would almost have the gateway offering of Drive to Survive, and then they would have the product of Formula One to then convert people into that proper Formula One fan who watches all the races. So it's quite a nice pathway that they would develop as in getting those rights. And I think, Netflix, you'll have a better understanding of Netflix's, live sports tactics that they're slowly developing more and more. We probably wouldn't have seen Netflix do this a few years ago, but we're now seeing them, really grow into that live sports offering.
The question I have, and I never actually followed up with Steve because Steve's our big wrestling guy, is my understanding is F1 TV is considered to be a great streaming platform in terms of some of the other data and content that it puts behind it. I know in the UK, because of the deal with Sky, it is not available here, but it sounds like abroad it's considered to be a very good product. Is that something you'd want to see or potentially get brought into Netflix? Do they almost have sort of a separate place to do that, or is that something that's going to exist separately? This is where I need to talk to Steve to understand what they've done with WWE. The way, is it going to be a DAZN style adoption of F1 TV, or is that something that maybe just goes away? I'd just be curious to know your kind of thoughts around that specifically.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some kind of integration there. F1 TV, the biggest market for F1 TV is the US, funnily enough. So I think some kind of crossover there with Netflix, whether there's like an integrated platform within Netflix, some kind of access point. I wouldn't be surprised if there's, some kind of tactic that's used there. I know, Stefano Domenicali, who's the president and chief executive of F1, has said they are looking into developing a more higher priced premium version of F1 TV that offers, avid fans a lot more depth and detail while watching races, so they can really, dive into like really specific data whilst watching the race. So I think that is, the next progression of Formula One's media rights strategy, where they're trying to give these, really avid fans much more, meaningful connection to what they're watching. That progression from, as I just mentioned, that progression from the casual Drive to Survive fan to this really engaged, what is the average tire temperature of this car kind of fan. Like, we're talking, that's a fast progression from that initial entry point.
So just to keep us moving along, in terms of switching from one sport to another one, looking at NASCAR, I'll admit, I'll put my hands up and, plead ignorance on this one. I wasn't aware of how big their media rights deals were. I think, what was it, $7.7 billion? Like that's not chump change. And then you start looking at it, they've got multiple different broadcast partners, some of them from a linear perspective, some from a streaming perspective. Like, I think maybe it's just because of where we work, what we speak from, like there's always all this talk about Formula One. And the reality is, like, NASCAR seemingly is doing quite well, even if it is mostly just domestic. So I guess maybe just the question is maybe why aren't people talking more about NASCAR? Is it just because it's so American focused? Is it because it's just sort of, it is what it is? Like, I'll just be honest, like I wasn't aware of how big that was. Like, trust me, I come from, my family's from Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. I got some NASCAR people in my family, but like, I was a little blown away looking into the numbers a bit.
I think from an international perspective, NASCAR is quite insular in that it's so American focused and American based that I think we internationally don't, consider it as much. But, $7.7 billion is a lot of money for a media rights deal, especially considering it's a 7-year deal. So we're talking over $1 billion per season for the NASCAR media rights. It's a lot. I think we might get into this, but it's quite interesting, the approach that they've taken to this new media rights deal in terms of how fragmented it is. It's across 4 different broadcasters. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how that develops and how that affects, the overall fandom of NASCAR, because I think the accessibility of watching the series that's going to drastically reduce because of the 4 different broadcasters throughout the season. I can really drill down into the granular, you have to switch between broadcasters for certain races kind of access. But it's going to be interesting to see how this develops.
Could you give us a bit more on that, Cian?
Yeah, so I think obviously for those who don't know, a motorsport weekend is split up into various sessions. You have practice sessions, qualifying sessions, and the main race. If you wanted to watch an entire weekend of action, so watching the practice, the qualifying, and the race, the practice and qualifying sessions for pretty much every race this season will sit on a different broadcaster to the broadcaster that shows the race. So we're talking, in terms of fan access, probably not a great approach. They've obviously done a really good job in generating over $1 billion per season for the next 7 years. But I'd be very interested what knock-on effect this is going to have long term.
I'm just curious to take it a step back into the actual entertainment product itself, Cian. Obviously, it's generating huge numbers, both financially and ratings-wise, in comparison to what we just discussed with F1. What's so great about the entertainment? Obviously, jokes aside of what we've talked about, is the racing? Do you think much more entertaining than watching an F1 race if you try to wear a more objective hat and just like if you were to watch it both for the first time?
Try and be objective about this. Personally, I can understand the appeal of NASCAR. I personally lean more towards open wheel racing, which is something like Formula One, something like IndyCar. I think there's definitely an art to understanding and loving oval racing, as Chris mentioned, just turning left all the time. But I think as you, get to understand the sport a bit more, oval racing does become a lot more interesting. I really struggled with it when I was first getting into motorsport. I didn't really understand the appeal of just watching a car literally go around in circles. But I think there is definitely an entertainment aspect there once I understood it. But I personally very much lean more towards a circuit racing where there is, lefts and rights.
I just wonder if they, like arm wrestlers have one massive arm from all the arm wrestling, because if they're always turning left, they all have like one massive shoulder muscle trying to steer the fight against the car turning left all the time. But anyway, I just think it's an interesting proposition because obviously they haven't been able to grow the sport outside of the US despite this insane popularity. I guess you could point to the NFL as another example of that, where something hasn't been able to grow. But also there's not a lot of oval tracks around the world that are going to give them the time to build an audience organically. I think that's the thing we've got a problem in sports, is where we all want these amazing quick wins. So that doesn't happen with these sports. These sports properties are built with legacy over decades of being around. I just think it's going to be a challenge for NASCAR ever to break out of the US and be more than it is. But who knows? Maybe we might see an oval track or two pop up in Europe in the coming years. I know they've done some European races, right, Cian? They've done something. They've got some sort of series from memory, but is that more circuit based?
So they do have a Euro series that's based over here. But I think, talking of NASCAR specifically, they are obviously very synonymous with oval racing, but I think they are noticing that in order to have that international growth, they need to start diversifying the kinds of circuits they race on. Last weekend, they raced at the Circuit of the Americas, which, for anyone who recognises the name of that circuit, that is one of the tracks that Formula One races at. They've expanded into Chicago. They host a street race around the streets of Chicago, which is very new, very different for NASCAR. And obviously, I've mentioned their race in Mexico this year, which will also be around a more traditional European style circuit. So I think this is NASCAR noticing that they can't just exclusively, stay true to their roots of oval racing. And if they want to have that, future expansion into Europe and, wider internationally, they need to have that diversified offering.
Yeah. So moving from one American series to another, and actually I'm going to bring weddings back into this. I went on a bachelor party, stag do, depending on what part of the world you're on, what word you use, IndyCar. I went to the Indy 500. And I watched the first lap and I watched the last lap. For those that don't know, the Indy 500, the track is so big. I believe there's a par 3 golf course on the inside. And not only is there a par 3 golf course on the inside, they also host a music festival in the Snake Pit. And just to show my age, Skrillex was the lead performer. So yeah, I watched the first lap of the Indy 500, went to a music festival ended, watched the last lap of the race. So, talking about entertainment, IndyCar's doing their different bits, but, Cian, just maybe talk to us a little bit. IndyCar seems to be the most synonymous with Formula One, just in terms of the structure, the way the race looks, sort of how they're going about building this. You talked a little bit about, they're looking to maybe piggyback a bit off of Formula One just because of the way it aesthetically looks.
Yeah, so there's definitely an element of that. I think you mentioned the Indy 500. There isn't, in my opinion, a race like the Indy 500 in the world. It's definitely one of the most iconic motorsport races. And I think IndyCar having that asset in its offering. It does so much for them. Marketing themselves to the world as more than as the Indy 500 is probably where the difficulties start coming in. I think a lot of European fans will watch the Indy 500, but then not watch anything else on offer from IndyCar, and I think that's where the difficulties are going to arise. If we look US specific, I think that's where IndyCar has maybe not done as much as it could. They've had a broadcast partnership with NBC for almost 2 decades that was relatively successful, but I don't think NBC did enough to market the series to the American public. We've now seen Fox take over the rights for this season, about $25 million a year they're paying for the rights now, I think. And we instantly saw a switch up in how IndyCar was marketed. Fox ran, I believe, 6 ads during the Super Bowl, the most recent Super Bowl for IndyCar, which is a serious level of marketing for a series that has not had much marketing before. They did an advert with Joseph Newgarden, who's one of the big stars in IndyCar, who won the Indy 500 last season, and it was Joseph Newgarden and Tom Brady in the advert. So this is sort of a new approach that IndyCar has not had before, and it's very interesting to see that IndyCar's season opening race was the most watched non-Indy 500 race for IndyCar since 2011. So there's clearly, success being born out of what Fox is trying to do with the series. 1.4 million viewers for that opening race is a number that F1 has very rarely hit in the US. So I would not be surprised this year if IndyCar sits above Formula One in the popularity rankings in the US. And I think, I'm really interested to see how IndyCar develops with a broadcaster that is putting, real investment into how it's marketed.
Well, for context, those Super Bowl ads would have equated to the money they spent on the rights. By the sounds of it, if you said 25 million, they would have probably spent that on those slots. Just on the IndyCar bit, Chris, just anecdotally, we're going back quite a bit of time. They used to run Indy race on the Gold Coast in Australia randomly, and it was an unbelievable experience. The whole city came to life around the circuit. There was parties going on in every single flat and apartment overlooking the circuit. Basically, you wouldn't often buy a general admission. You would just go to someone's house, need to have a mate to contact, and you would just perch up in someone's flat and be partying on for the whole weekend. But what happened was, after a while, they did some studies and realized that no one actually cared about the Indy racing. They only cared about the party, and they just switched it to the V8 supercars in Australia. And the fans still come in droves, and it doesn't cost them nearly as much to bring it to the city. But the experience was something else. The question I had, Cian, really is that we've talked about the US market in particular, which is where the Indies and NASCAR's base and home is. In terms of consuming it outside of those core markets, what experiences do they have? Apps and like equivalent like F1 TV available that the bulk of fans outside of the US will be watching? They obviously have a sprinkling of broadcast deals in place in certain markets as well. Just talk a bit about that visibility outside the US.
So they've got a pretty comprehensive international broadcaster suite. I think it's quite difficult to compare. You're never going to get the same level of interest as they do domestically. I'm fairly sure NASCAR is shown on Premier Sports in the UK, but I'm unconvinced if that's true. I think it's very difficult to know where it's shown. I know IndyCar is obviously shown on Sky Sports F1. That Fox and previously NBC broadcast is sub-licensed through the Sky Sports F1 channel, and I think from a European point of view, it's a lot easier to connect with IndyCar than NASCAR because it's obviously so close to F1. You've got, former F1 drivers have competed in IndyCar as well, which I think helps, fans make that jump. You've got, the likes of Marcus Ericsson currently races in IndyCar. Romain Grosjean raced in IndyCar last season. So you've got that point of connection, which I think makes it a lot easier for European fans to make that jump into the new series, whereas NASCAR is quite different. There have been occasions where, the likes of Kimi Räikkönen or Jenson Button have done a one-off, entry into a race in NASCAR. But outside of that, there's no common, theme that fans can connect with. It's very, very different to what they're used to.
So the last sports property we'll talk about, I'm going to try to wrap it into one thing that connects all of them, then slightly different, is MotoGP. We talked on it a little bit, but I almost want to talk a little bit about Fox Sports, because we've talked about all these competitions. IndyCar's moved to Fox, you said, with great success. One of the multiple partners NASCAR has is Fox Sports. The last one we're going to talk about is MotoGP. I believe you reported on it. They've just agreed a U.S. partnership with Fox Sports. So maybe before I go to Fox Sports, before I get to MotoGP, talking about potentially more on the Liberty Media side and what that means for the long-term growth, do you see this as a calculated move by Fox Sports that they are acquiring all these different motorsports rights? Now, I don't think we're expecting them to go into the Formula One side of things, but they seem to be gathering up all the other major rights in the U.S.
Yeah, so I think there is obviously a link there. I think the main thing, from my point of view, that we need to focus on is that Fox owns the rights to obviously the Indy 500 through IndyCar, but also the Daytona 500 through its NASCAR deal. Fox obviously doesn't own all the rights to NASCAR. It's just the first portion of the season. But having arguably two of the biggest races in the world on the same channel instantly makes that a destination for motorsport, regardless of what other rights they hold to other series. I think those two races alone are enough to really move the needle for the broadcaster. We're talking about, in terms of viewership, these two races, while not anywhere near the kind of viewership they used to get, Daytona and Indy 500 used to get in 15, 20 million viewers per race in the 2000s. Whereas now, Daytona, I think we're talking, 6 to 8 million viewers per race. Indy 500 is quite similar. They've both suffered with weather in recent years that has maybe, skewed it slightly negatively. But these are still really strong races and the strongest races for viewerships in the respective series. So owning those two races is, for me, that's the most important part of Fox's motorsport strategy, because that's clearly where most of the casual viewers are going to come in and watch those races. On the IndyCar front as well, I think it's important to point out that Fox has agreed to show the entire season on its main commercial channel, which is the first time, I believe, any motorsport series will have been shown exclusively through a commercial network. So that's 17 slots throughout the season, 19 if you include Indy 500 qualifying. That level of visibility is unprecedented, and I think IndyCar is really going to benefit from that.
Yeah, awesome. So kind of leading that in, we talked about MotoGP. It's just been picked up in the US, and this will be the last question, Cian, because I know we gotta move on. But given the, you're expecting the Liberty Media deal to go through, how much do you expect the strategy for MotoGP to follow what Formula One did? Is Liberty Media going to try to, obviously they will do it in a slightly different way. How much do you expect it to look similar to what Formula One did, even in the way it's trying to grow internationally, not just more in its European base? Just what you think that will look like for MotoGP moving forward?
So I think you've hit the nail on the head a little bit there, because I think the strategy does need to be different. There does need to be a different approach for MotoGP. It's not going to be as simple as just copy and pasting the Formula One approach and just expecting it to work for MotoGP. It's a very different series. It's a lot more connected, I think, to its European roots. It's got a very strong base in Western Europe, specifically, Spain, France, Italy. That is a very strong heartland for the series. And you also have a very, very strong fan base in Southeast Asia, with the motorcycle market in that region of the world is crazy. They have such a huge fan base in Southeast Asia. So I think it's going to be very, very different. I think Formula One, whilst it wasn't obviously as big as it is today, was definitely a lot more known comparably around the world, where I think MotoGP is, in a way, a lot more niche, especially in the years since Valentino Rossi left the series. He was, a massive star of MotoGP. Everyone knows who Valentino Rossi is. So losing that asset, I think, has been difficult for the series in recent years. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how Liberty Media compensates for that and, really tries to build up the image of MotoGP as a whole, moving forward. They've undergone a big rebrand ahead of this season already before the takeover has even been confirmed. So I think we're seeing, signs of the Liberty Media effect already before it's officially confirmed as the new owner. But I think that American market is going to be very, very important for them.
Yeah, and the thing that just stands out for me with MotoGP, I remember years ago, I don't even know why, I ended up going to Valencia for some reason to go to an event, and I met with Dorna's leadership team, and I can't remember why exactly I was out there. But I didn't realize before even going there really just how Spanish the leadership and the business is. And if you look actually even at their calendar today, not only they have 4 or plus races in Spain, but they even use the local flags to for the areas like Catalonia and the Valencia region. I don't know what it is. They use the different flags for just those regions. It's so strong in those markets. So it'd be interesting to see how, if they're able to, the balance between keeping those roots and leaning into that fan base they have in Spain well, but also being able to globalize it is obviously a huge opportunity.
They've got 7 races in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, which in a 22 race calendar is crazy. I think 4 races in Spain, 1 in Portugal. So in that Algarve region specifically, it's huge amount of races for one calendar. And from what I'm hearing, MotoGP is, I think, maybe aware that this is too much and wants to move to only 2 races in the Algarve region moving forward, which is going to be quite a big reduction from what we're used to. But I think that is, yet another sign of, Liberty's influence of, globalization. We need to be more international.
Well, Cian, I appreciate you coming on and giving us far more information than we would have ever been able to provide on a motorsport front. I know it's towards the end of the episode, but Nick mentioned the Black Book Motorsport Forum is coming up soon. If you don't know about it, you can reach out to Cian on LinkedIn, find Pete Jones on LinkedIn, find Black Book Motorsport Forum website. Also, Cian, I know you've been working very hard on producing some reports. Those might be familiar with our NFL reports or NBA reports we do every year. You've also been working very hard on getting those all out. So maybe I'll give you 30 seconds, 60 seconds to shout out some of that hard work for people to go catch those when they're released.
Yeah, so the reason I have so many stats at the front of my mind is that I've just been chock full of research for the various business reports and commercial guides that we offer. We have 5 in the motorsport sphere: Formula E, NASCAR, IndyCar, MotoGP, and Formula One. NASCAR and Formula E are available now for you to purchase and to have for yourself. The other 3 will be following very shortly, but they are, comprehensive overviews of the series as a whole, of the teams, of the sponsors, of the broadcasters, data and analytics behind the scenes, and various insights into those respective series. And yeah, as Chris mentioned, the Black Book Motorsport Forum, which is later this month, I guess brings that all together in a public forum. And I personally believe we have the best agenda that we've ever had for the forum this year. So very much looking forward to the event.
Definitely.
Right. Awesome.
Some really big names on that list. I just also want to make sure that we shout out the Mike's Out podcast, Cian, that you also produce. So if you're interested in listening to more dulcet tones of Cian Brittle and the rest of the team around the business of motorsport, make sure you find that on your favorite podcast platform of choice. And also that the data that Cian's referencing is available in those reports. And some of that data is alongside also, or will be alongside the commercial guides we have on the SportsPro website as well, where we have a bunch of other properties on top of the motorsport ones available for people to access that sort of intelligence. So go check that out. And if you need any more information, like Chris said, reach out to Cian on the motorsport front. And if you want any more information about the other parts we mentioned, reach out to Chris and myself.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsPro Nick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Streamtimers. Until next time.